Well, now that I started recording, you have to say something funny again.
Well, hello there, guys. What we're going to be doing here is a special.
Dude, I haven't seen your face in a while, and that beard is so epic. I feel like everything you say just has more weight now, you know? Serious question. Do people react differently to you with that beard, especially with the gray in it, than they used to?
Yeah, I mean, I get all the credibility of orthodoxy while still getting to be Catholic. They're like, this dude's got a beard, man.
I remember hearing Penn Jillette, the magician guy from Penn and Teller, talking about how he lost a ton of weight, like, I don't know, 100 pounds or something. He used to be a really big guy. And he said he had to relearn his entire act because the effect he had on stage, like he would take 3 steps to the right and pause dramatically, being of a certain size, like everything was different when he was skinnier. So he had to change his whole body language and everything because it had a different way of, impacting people. So,
oh, dude,
what have you had to change because of your beard? That's where we start.
Oh man, it's like Ye said, y'all dealing with grandpa now. Y'all dealing with grandpa.
You can tell I'm trying to, this. I can't get a full beard though. It just won't happen. So this is just not shaving over the holidays.
Have you ever tried to grow one?
I mean, I always eventually shave because there's just too many patches that don't grow anything, and it would look just horrible. So,
well, I'm pretty unkempt right now. I need to clean up and shave, but I look at it this way, man. I'm finally evolving into my true role as Black Santa Claus. Like that's where my life is ultimately heading, and I'm gonna become the personification of Christmas.
So, why did you have to say Black Santa Claus? Why is it just assumed that Santa is white? Come on.
Because like Stanley from The Office says, man, Santa Claus is white. I don't want no Black Santa Claus.
Before I got on here with you, somehow I was talking with my family, like, yeah, I'm going to do a podcast with TK. And somehow it came up that your 3 heroes, the Holy Trinity for TK in childhood, and even when I first met you, it was Brian McKnight, Denzel Washington, and Michael Jordan. And Lachlan, who's 7, and he loves sports, he was like, he likes Michael Jordan? And I said, yeah. And he's like, because Michael Jordan's black? And I just said, yes, that is why.
We all know if Michael Jordan was white, nobody would care about that guy.
Dude, speaking of, we're gonna kick this off with a little modern NBA, but a throwback. Somebody just sent me, and this happens to me like once every 2 years, because my brain cannot remember just how great this dude was, and I have to rediscover it. And every time I go watch highlights again, I freak out. How Jason Williams, oh my gosh,
oh man,
his you remember behind the back, and then he bumps it with his elbow and passes it. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that guy was amazing. White chocolate.
White chocolate, man. His passes were so sick. And you know what's funny too about that era is so many people want to make it about whether or not Jordan could have succeeded in the era of LeBron when everybody's shooting threes and Jordan and Scotty's Bulls didn't have the pressure to shoot threes. I think that's the wrong question. I think the real question is, how much more of a star would guys like Steve Kerr, John Paxson, Mark Price, you know what I mean? All those dudes who in the 80s, 90s were just sort of journeymen or really respected, but they weren't megastars. Man, you put Detlef Schrempf and Rick Smits in today's NBA, you put David Robinson in today's NBA, man, like so many of those guys. So it's funny that people make the plumbers argument because they think about Karl Malone and Charles Barkley and how those guys weren't chucking up threes, and they can't imagine those guys fitting in today's NBA. But it's every team had 2 to 3 point specialists who shot at a really high rate, and it was sort of hey, you're only going to get 2 shots a game.
Yeah,
but you better be ready and you better knock them down. And those guys are reliable for that. You give those guys 20 to 30 shots a game with no hand checking in today's NBA, man.
So what is this is all the buzz on Twitter. NBA ratings are down. They're really low. They're the lowest they've been in a long time. Fans aren't interested in the NBA.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, what's going on? They're all debating. I want to get your take. I know you haven't been following it really closely in the last few years, but I don't care because your off the cuff take is going to be more fun and more interesting, probably more correct.
Well, in some ways, I'm qualified precisely for that reason, because we know in the last few years, I've gone from watching the actual games to just paying more attention to the narratives. And I can tell you, from a guy who loves the WWE component, the KFAB component, that the NBA has never been weaker in terms of its narratives. There are no really compelling stories. These guys are so talented. They're so amazing to watch. There's a ton of really great eye candy in the NBA. I mean, watching Ja Morant, watching Luka, watching Steph, like, these guys are terribly fun to watch, but there's no compelling narratives. It's like no tradition. Even the Boston Celtics are probably the closest thing we have now to someone that you can love or hate because of the element that the tradition plays. But even then, it's sort of like, I mean, is there anyone on that team that you really hate, you know, without like forcing it? None of those guys really make me too mad. I think LeBron and Steph and them guys going up against each other in the finals for so many years was maybe the last compelling narrative we had. You know, you think about in the 80s, 90s, no one ever argued. And I owe this insight to you because I think the way you put it was defined by stories, not stats. Whereas this generation, the debates are defined by stats, not stories. And so if someone's debating LeBron and MJ or LeBron and Steph today, they're just appealing to the records broken, to the stat lines. But when you go back to Magic versus Bird, what did people talk about? They talk about things like that last second steal against the Pistons that determined everything. Does anyone know how many rebounds Bird had that game? Does anyone care, you know, what his field goal percentage was that game? What matters is that one steal that we all remember, and it changed history, right? We think about the clutch shots that Jordan knocked down, like the shot part 1 and 2 against Cleveland. Does anybody remember what his field goal percentage was? What his stat line was? You know, or that shot that Stockton hits to send the Jazz to the finals for the first time, or like, I don't know if Magic cared how many assists he had, but he cared about beating Bird. And we remember moments where it's like, remember the past where Magic looks that way and dishes it to Worthy.
They cared about winning and doing it in a way that visually demonstrated their superiority, right?
Yeah.
Right? And that's what made it fun. It was like the win, but also the taunt, the trash talk, the flashy pass. There was a style element too. And the stat sheet was not a big deal. I mean, imagine back in the day, imagine people being like, you know, a current thing you'll see today is like they'll put 2 players' stats side by side and they'll be like, but y'all ain't ready for that conversation. And it'll be like, you know, one guy that's considered good and one that's not, as if the stats, because they're close, that the 2 guys deserve to be in the same conversation, which is an absurd idea. Can you imagine being in the era we grew up in with someone being like Reggie Miller's 3-point percentage next to Steve Kerr's and being like, y'all ready? You're not ready for that conversation. It'd be like, no, because it's a stupid conversation. Steve Kerr is a great role player who does his job when he's asked. Reggie Miller is Reggie Miller. He's a killer. He's the leader of that team. He is the Pacers guy. People fear him. They're different categories of player. But today they'll just look at those stats and they'll be like, oh, I mean, thinking about, you know, if someone's like, hey, look at the stats that Shea Gilgeous-Alexander's putting up right now and the stats that John Morant's putting up, and they're playing each other today, I'll be like, well, if anything cool happens, I'll see a highlight of it on Twitter. Back in the day, I don't know what John Stark's stats were ever. I have no idea, but I hated John Stark's. And if it was like regular season Pacers versus Knicks on a Sunday afternoon, I'm going to tune in. I'm not a fan of either team. But I was like, I kind of like Reggie Miller, and I like that he talks and I know a fight's going to break out or something intense is going to happen. That's going to be a heated game. It's going to be nasty. It's going to be fun. It had, like, you know, they've batted heads before in the playoffs, and they've got a little bit of animosity, and these things could build over time because players stayed there for a long time. And so you'd remember all the previous matchups where bad blood got involved and this person and this and that, like, you would tune in for that because it was drama. There's no drama now. It's just stats. And
it takes time to build that too, right? So you think about Reggie Miller and the New York Knicks and how Spike Lee wasn't even a player on the court, but he sat front side every game and he talked smack to Reggie Miller all the time. And there's this rivalry that develops between Reggie Miller versus the Knicks through Spike Lee. And there's a game where Reggie gets hot, and every time he hits a three, he looks at Spike and he starts cursing at him. And Spike Lee has a girl that's sitting with him. I don't know if it's a date or not, but she starts laughing, you know, and teasing Spike about it. And, you know, Miller has that moment against the Knicks where it's like down by 6 with about 6 or 7 seconds. And he hits those 2 clutch threes and he turns to Spike and makes the choking gesture, right? Today, you might get attacked for that. You might get fined for that. But I think about it in terms of Marvel movies or any other kind of myth that we like. Who's watching Batman and loving that film without a good villain? Who's watching Superman and cares without a good villain? You have to have someone that makes you a little bit afraid that they're going to undermine the person you love. You got to have someone that you hate a little bit. And in the 80s, 90s, sometimes these people weren't necessarily the all-stars. They might have been like characters who were bruisers. You know, like you were afraid of Lambier because the way that he could irritate, or you think about Rodman, for instance, the way that Rodman could just irritate your favorite player and take them out of the game mentally. Bill Lambier wasn't as good as like Rodman, but Lambier was so effective mentally on people. The cheap fouls, the tactics, the mental warfare. I think about Raja Bell and how he became a celebrity just because it's like this guy didn't really play like he cared very much, but it was time to play against Kobe. It meant everything to him. And there were guys who were like that. It's like, you know what? I'm going to make my career on being the guy to just give Kobe fits.
Dude, so, as soon as Kobe was like, they're like, Raja Bell said he's going to shut you down. And he said, who is this kid? And I was like, I'm tuning into the next matchup. I have to see it now. My take is like, the narrative, the drama is missing and it's stats instead of stories. And if you're like, okay, well, what would you do to fix it? I guess sort of if you reverse engineer, what is the thing that leads to that? I think there's kind of maybe three things. One is, I don't know how you would do it. I don't care to get into, but like, if you can find a way that guys stay with teams a lot longer and they stop team hopping, and it's much harder for them to build super teams. And like Kevin Durant's played on like 5 teams in the last 7 years or something. I don't know who to associate with him with anymore. There's no time to build up. What team is his nemesis? Right. It's like, you lose that drama when guys change teams all the time.
And if Phoenix makes it to the finals, who do you really want to see Kevin Durant go up against in the East? It doesn't really matter if it's the Celtics or the Hawks. My emotions aren't going to be the same.
And because players rotate all the time, there's this rotating cast. Like you knew for like periods of maybe 2 to 5 years that there were maybe 2 to 3 teams who were always going to have to go through each other in the East and in the West. And then, over time they rotate out, but not quickly. Like a team can stay there and be that team where it's like, oh, we're going to see them again in the conference finals for 2-3 years in a row. You get that rivalry going. So make it harder for guys to hop teams. And then just call way fewer fouls. Bring back hand checking, call fewer fouls, call fewer technical fouls, let it get more physical. And the combination of those two things, you will start to have rivalries. You will start to have bad blood. You will start to let it get a little chippier. You'll have guys who are there year after year. They got to face each other more times over time. They got to get through each other to playoffs. And then I think the final thing is more on the deliberate narrative crafting and media side. And I'm going to argue that the biggest damage done to making fans not care about watching games has been done by a massive army of media people and promoters who are trying so hard to make the case for LeBron James' greatness. Because when LeBron James was struggling to live up to his hype in Cleveland, and then he left for Miami, that's a huge narrative hit. That's a huge narrative hit. That's a guy running away. His home fans are burning the jerseys. He's joining a super team. And this push by like him and his supporters and his clutch empire and this increasingly large group of media people that seem to always be in his pocket. It was like, okay, I don't know that we can win I'm the greatest, or I should even be in the conversation with Kobe or whatever based on the narrative anymore. So we have to change everything over to stats. And it's just stats. Because if we just make it about stats, LeBron can get like more rebound. He can average more rebounds than Kobe or Jordan, right? LeBron can play in more games and he can put and it just became this stat thing. It's not exclusive to him, but I think the LeBron fans constantly obsessively trying to shove down our throats the idea that he belongs in the greatness conversation, their only go-to has been stats over and over and over again, because the eyeball test isn't there. He doesn't have the flashy moves of a Magic Johnson. And then the narrative stuff isn't there. He keeps running and leaving teams and throwing players under the bus and getting players that were really good, and then they're worse when they play for him, and blaming coaches. That's a hard one for him to win. And so it's like stats, stats, stats. And I think that obsession with stats was like, always, don't watch LeBron's games. Just look at his stats. Just look at the stats. And then the stats over time, but he's played so many years, it's like total points scored, total assists. And it just becomes this giant. And then you see in the way people play. I remember when Russell Westbrook was on the MVP season, it was absurd the phony rebounds and assists this dude was getting just to get those stats, the triple-double stat. You watch games now, you can see guys playing for stats more than anything else, more than chemistry, more than wins, more than, because they know that's all people are going to. So you don't have to watch the games. You just get on Twitter and you do your side-by-side stat muse comparison and say player A is better than player B because look at the stats. And then everyone's like, well, look at these other advanced stats. Oh, well, look at these other advanced stats. Oh, well, look, you know what I mean? It's like, that's where we've come to. Why do I need to watch the game?
Yeah. So the LeBron is a very interesting aspect of all this, because I don't think that all happened overnight. And I think the LeBron timeline gets really interesting as it pertains to this discussion when you consider the emergence of Steph. Because prior to that, to me, the LeBron narrative became more powerful and intriguing. When he's in Cleveland, at that point, he's the king and he's loved. And even the Jordan comparisons are not as strong, and the debate just isn't as heated. Like, people are kind of okay with the idea that, hey, maybe this guy can pass Jordan. His career is young enough to kind of be undecided. We're open to the argument. He's doing his thing. And the expectations aren't too high, because it's not like he has a super team in Cleveland. And so there's some pressure, but at the same time, nobody's feeling like he can't be the GOAT because he hasn't won a championship in Cleveland. When he makes a decision in his prime to go to Miami and live in a fun city, play alongside D Wade, according to the dominant narratives at that time, all the old school heads were hating on him, and this was a big no-no. You know, you hear guys like Jordan, you hear guys like Barkley be like, you know, what if Jordan had just joined the Pistons? What if Magic had just joined the Celtics, right? So LeBron broke the cardinal rule when it came to how stars saw success at that time, and he created a new trend, and he became a villain. Now, I don't think he wanted to become a villain. I think that kind of hurt him, the way he saw Cleveland fans reacting, and I don't think he really estimated how betrayed many people would feel. But it was kind of like Kobe's moment, where Black Mamba was born and he becomes a villain, and he goes from being golden boy to being blamed for Shaq leaving. And that's interesting. And he goes to Miami and people want to see him lose, and he starts succeeding. He's thriving. He plays the best ball he's ever played in like those first few years in Miami. And he makes it to the finals. And so many people were just happy to see Dallas beat them that first time around, right? And the Cleveland fans are happy, but he comes back and wins a couple. And I think those Miami years, it was like, wow, the Heatles are a fascinating team, because they're fun to watch. They've got a lot of star power. They're really difficult to beat, but they're still vulnerable. And LeBron's got this villain narrative where you want to see people want to see him lose. But even then, he goes to Cleveland, and now you have the opportunity for this really fascinating love story, where even if you hate LeBron from a narrative point, it's fascinating. He returns home with perfect timing, right? And leads this team to the finals. And if he can get that first championship for Cleveland, regardless of where he stands on the MJ debate, that's a nice little thing on his legacy. And that's really awesome, because one championship in Cleveland means way more than like 20 in LA, right? You got to win like 30 championships for a Lakers fan to care about you. That will always be Magic City, Kobe City. LeBron got them a championship. They're like, okay, yeah, but shouldn't we have like 3 or 4 already?
That's an asterisk championship, by the way. Go ahead. Mickey Mouse ring.
But Cleveland's grateful for that forever, right? But it's around the time where Steph emerges and the Warriors emerge completely off script. And I can't prove this, but it just felt to me like Steph was such an anomaly and the Warriors were such an anomaly. And there is no case that could be made that the Clay, Dre, and Steph combo who took the Warriors to that finals that first year was some kind of super team that was assembled in a way that even remotely resembled what the Celtics did when they got KG and Pierce and Ray together, and what the Miami Heat did. Like, these guys built through the draft.
Or what, when he went back to Cleveland with Kyrie and Love.
Yeah, these guys built through the draft. They took guys that nobody thought would be that good, including Steph. And not only that, they were not predicted to go to the finals the year that they won. And even when they won, going into that 70-year win season, they were not predicted to even go to the finals. The Spurs were the favorites, and like Golden State shocked the world, and they became a super team later. And then that whole narrative took over of, you know, KD joining a 70-win team. But like, without getting too far into that, at that point, you start to see this tension where it's like LeBron, who is, his narrative is kind of the most interesting thing about the NBA right now. And that's kind of organic. You know, nothing about that feels manipulated. Him leaving Cleveland, Cleveland hating him going back. But now the Warriors are the team, and they kind of get KD. And then there's this resentment now, because it's like, you guys just ruined it for LeBron. LeBron just had a great narrative that was organic. He was in a perfect position to, like, especially in the East at that time, to maybe be able to string off a dynasty. Like, LeBron was in a perfect situation, man. I think you take the Warriors out of it, that Cleveland team might be getting like 5 or 6 championships.
Oh yeah.
You know?
Well, I don't know who else in the West, but in the East, I mean, the East was just a joke. And yeah, maybe in the West there wasn't a lot. I can't think of a lot of teams that, you know.
Yeah, and maybe, but you know, like, yeah, you only got one team in the West that you got to beat. You know what I mean? One team in the West you got to beat. And it felt like the NBA didn't know how to handle Steph, and in some ways seemed to kind of resent the way that Steph is affecting the narrative. And it sort of felt like these guys are, you felt from like the commentators, you know, the Stephen A. Smiths, the all those guys,
Charles Barkley.
Yeah, just like this really intense anger at KD for ruining the NBA, which, you know, really means like ruining LeBron. Nobody was concerned about ruining anything for the Raptors.
Well, yeah, I do like the NBA. I mean, those were the days when people were watching. The ratings were killer, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I mean, Steph playoff games have carried the ratings for years. That's what's crazy when people talk about this. If you go look game by game, for the last decade almost, all of the highest watched games include Steph Curry. Like, he's the most interesting thing to watch. But yeah,
that Steph LeBron era is so good.
Right. Yeah. Right. And like, yet he is, there definitely seems to be a deliberate effort to like get him out of the way, because we're trying to have other narratives going on here. Like, there's something about that dude that like gets in the way of some other attempt at creating another narrative, another agenda. And I think fighting that for so many years and choosing to go the stat direction kind of like worked on everybody. But the problem with that direction is, once all the intrigue becomes about stats, now it's like trading baseball cards instead of watching baseball. It's just like, let's all just look at stats and let's just make memes about stats and let's compare stats. You don't need to watch the game. You know, I think it like worked too well in a way to get people to start to believe that greatness was a statistical thing.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think, in addition to it being about stat that maybe the NBA made a mistake by following the Jordan formula with LeBron? Because like when Jordan retired, one of the troubles that the NBA had, because there was this gap of time where it was kind of like, ratings are down, and they're looking for the next Jordan.
I'm going to go no. I'm going to give you a hot take. I think it was the opposite problem.
Okay.
I think they waited too long. They resisted the Jordan formula too long for Kobe. And they should have just leaned in right away and realized Kobe is the best thing going. He's the next Jordan. He's the guy. Let's lean into that. It took them too long. They tried to destroy him. They didn't let Chris Paul join his team. They like, you know, and then by the end of his career, it was like, okay, we can do that, because he kind of like willed it for himself. But that's what the fans like. That's what they want. They want David and Goliath. Like, they want a new Goliath. You either loved Jordan or hated him, you know, but you knew every other team's star that they liked would have to face Jordan and beat Jordan. And then with LeBron, they went that route, which I think was the right move. And I think it like could work as he started to get, especially when he went to Miami. Then he could play that villain role, which I think was working. And people were like, let's see him get beaten and whatever.
Yeah.
When Steph came on the scene, they should have leaned into that with Steph. That's the problem, right? Like, it's not that they did it too much with LeBron. It's that they didn't do it when another guy who clearly was driving the whole league, was dominating the league's interest. Every team feared Curry more than anybody else. Every team changed their entire defensive scheme because of Curry. He was the thing that when you're playing against him, like that's the thing. You're tuning in to watch him, to see what crazy thing he'll do, or to shut him down, or to slander him. Lean into it. And like, I don't care who it is, whoever emerges next, if there's something organic that starts to come and be that guy, like I wish they would lean into it more with Jokic now or whoever. Like, pick that dude. I think that's great. I think it's actually great for the league. Let the other guys get bitter that they don't get enough attention. You know, that creates more storylines. That's great. Instead of like everybody's all equal and they all have a lot of stats we can debate about. That's boring.
Well, this goes back to your point too about
the NFL, like the Patriots. They were such a dynasty for so long. I think that was great for the NFL, you know?
Yeah. Well, this goes back to your storyline about building great teams, because part of, you know, I don't want to sound too much like the good old days of the 80s and 90s, but just
with a beard like that, everyone will hear you that way, no matter what you actually say.
Right. But I think one of the things they did right, or one of the things they got right in terms of narratives, was you had a lot of teams that didn't have a bunch of great players, and they were still compelling and interesting going up against your team, right? The Bad Boys, I mean, they did have, you know, one of the greatest point guards of all time. I think Joe Dumars was great, but they also had a bunch of like characters, like Vinny the Microwave Johnson. You had guys like John Sally who were interesting. Bill Laimbeer was interesting. And part of them were interesting because teams had character. They had an ethos, right? The Portland Trailblazers, it's like Duckworth wasn't an all-star. You had Jerome Kersey and Cliff Robinson. You had Terry Porter and Clyde Drexler. And there was an identity and a character and a chemistry that team had.
When you watch any sports movie, it's always like the star, and then like maybe another kind of secondary stars, and then like the weird zany guy, and then like the guy who and everybody has a character, right? Like that's what a team in the fictional portrayals is. Yeah. And that's what a good team should be like too. You got like that one guy who never talks, but he goes out and kills it. You got the one guy who trash talks all the time and is super over the top and loud, but he's got like you need, to your point, you need characters. You need those guys that have like a spot in the team and they do the thing that they do.
Yeah. And so like implicit in the concept of team is like, hey, whether we like each other or not, because Jordan and Scottie didn't talk to Rodman, according to those guys, for that entire 3-year run, right? but a team, they never spoke to each other off the court, really. But for a team, it's like, whether we like each other or not, we're family. And that's kind of what a real family is like. In a real family, it's like, man, I didn't get to choose my siblings. I didn't get to choose my parents, but these are kind of the people that I'm stuck with, and I got to make it work because I don't have the freedom to just be like, oh, I don't like the way you voted. I'm not dealing with you anymore. It's like, nope, we still got to share a bathroom and, you know, share a fridge, and we're just going to freaking work this out, right? And so when there's a kind of chemistry and a character identity that develops when you just got to play with each other and work it out, and also in a competitive context, it's like, we're a team and we got to beat those guys. You look at today's NBA, it's kind of like, none of these guys need to feel any loyalty to each other. You know, if one guy gets picked on or bullied, like the teammates are like, man, they're like people working at McDonald's. If the McDonald's gets robbed, it's like, I don't own this place. I'm not getting involved in your business. You know what I mean? I don't get paid enough for this. And so it's like in today's NBA, you have one guy could get beat up by the other team, and everybody's thinking about the fines they get for leaving the bench. And they're like,
there's only one guy in the whole NBA who's trying to stop that stuff the way the guys did in the old school, and that's Draymond Green, and he's constantly getting ejected.
Hey, Scary Terry too. Terry
right? That. Like every team had a guy like that. You need a guy like that, you know? Yeah. So we'll get off the NBA stuff.
I guess we solved that.
What's that?
I guess we solved that.
We solved it. It's totally solved. Do you think there are ways in which, because I've been kind of thinking about this, the things that have changed between fans' relationship to the NBA has any analogs in other parts of culture, or is a reflection of, or is reflected in the way that people relate to other areas of life, politics or religion or anything else? Do you see it? Do you see any parallels there?
Yeah, I think anytime cultural shifts happen, you're going to see those cultural shifts manifest in everything from comedy to entertainment to pop culture, all these sorts of things. And I think the role of story, because that's what we're talking about, right? Narrative. And there are lots of interesting things happening across all spectrums when it comes to narrative and story. We see a sort of return to ancient traditions, a return to whether that comes in the form of religion, where there's this shift away from the popular view of I'm spiritual but not religious, to people wanting something rooted in tradition that existed before they were born. You see, even outside of the religious context, a deeper fascination with ancient mythology or more older forms of spirituality. You see a longing for narrative-based meaning, even in popular political discussion. I think even just in the recent election, I think one of the reasons that Kamala, in spite of what the polls tried to convince everyone, I think one of the reasons she fell so miserably is because there was nothing there narrative-wise that stuck and that resonated with people. They tried to manufacture some things. They tried to guilt trip people in some certain ways. They tried to say, well, hey, look, here's a way that she connects to you. But the reason they had to try so hard is because there was no kind of like organic narrative in the way that you saw with somebody like Bill Clinton being on Arsenio Hall playing the saxophone and stuff like that, right? So yeah, I think I see it in a lot of different ways. The importance of narrative, the hunger for it, and the way in which people are failing or miserable because they don't have a sense of that.
Yeah, people talk a lot about they'll call it the meaning crisis, and often saying, hey, it's concentrated on young men in particular, and it's been something for probably a decade that's been kind of a big thing, and guys like Jordan Peterson have become very big trying to address this. And I think it is a really great reflection of the same phenomena we're talking about in the NBA. It's like, yeah, you can give me all these statistical arguments and spreadsheets and facts you want, but at the end of the day, I'm tuning out of the game because there's no meaning in it for me. What's the story that's bigger than those stats? What's the story I can place myself in and that has meaning and that feels energizing? And of course, sports is just a small microcosm. It's a simulated version of that. But we want in our simulations to see slaying the dragon to save the princess. We want that meaning in there because that's what we want in life in general. And if you're like, hey, this warrior, check out his sword speed, it's really good. You're like, I don't care about his sword speed. Did he slay the dragon? Did he save the princess? You're like, what are you talking about? Let's just compare his sword speed to this guy with an axe and like his axe speed. Let's look at their total kills. And, well, it's like, no, that's you're missing something there. And I think that's why you saw kind of the big shift that you alluded to of people away from kind of materialist, scientist, sort of new atheist type movement, which is all facts and data. And like the science says, oh, we have an answer for that. Here's a bunch of numbers about the way neurons fire in the brain and whatever else. And it got to a point where people are like, that was cool for a while. It's fun for a while when all you've been immersed in is story and someone starts bringing statistics and the statistics say that this guy who you think is really good and inspiring actually isn't as good as this other guy. It's kind of fun at first because it's counterintuitive. Oh, science says that prayer actually doesn't work. And it's like, oh, this is like counterintuitive and it's edgy. But then you follow that long enough and it ends up utterly devoid of meaning and boring, and you feel hollow and empty. That's how the NBA feels right now. It's hollow and empty because it's all just stats. And I think that meaning crisis has been reflected. And now you see this huge turn where people are like, I don't care. I want it to mean something. I want to be a part of a story that means something. And I got to throw this in here because I'm drinking my Cavassier Yeah, that's correct. But no,
do you want to do one of those little sponsor moments now?
my Lions whiskey tumbler. But contrast what you see in the NBA and people not being interested in watching that with what you're seeing in the NFL. Just last week, Monday Night Football, you had the Lions playing the 49ers. This is a meaningless game. There's 2 games left in the season. The 49ers can't make the playoffs. They're playing for nothing. Some other guys are resting even. The Lions, even if they lose, doesn't make a difference. If they win the last game of the season, which is this week, they get the number 1 seed. And if they lose it, they don't get the number 1 seed. So this is irrelevant to both teams. It truly doesn't matter. The most watched Monday Night Football game in 5 years. And both teams went all out and played like it was the freaking Super Bowl. Why? Narrative and story. Last year, NFC Championship, the Lions team, underdog team, had an amazing year. They come in, they're up big at halftime against the 49ers in San Francisco. They blow the lead. They lose in heartbreaking fashion. This year, they had that game circled on their calendar all year long. We're going to go into San Francisco. We're going to get vengeance for what happened last year. Yeah. Even though when it came to it, it ended up being a meaningless game, which no one expected, no implications for the playoffs. Any reasonable person, if you're thinking like a materialist, like an atheist, you're going to say, a sports atheist, rest your guys. Why the heck would the Lions try to win this game? It has no impact. You're the most injured team in the NFL. Why are you going to risk more injuries? You're sacrificing your chances at a Super Bowl. Rest up. This is a free week. It's a bye week. But because they don't play that way, because their coach, Dan Campbell, is literally the most like narrative, mythical, like we're in this for the meaning. He's like crying when he's talking to his guys and like, man, this is what it's all about. He's like that. It's magnetic. Fans want to see it. Players want to play for it. And everybody tunes in to watch this game more than any Monday night game of the whole season. And it's statistically meaningless, right? Like, because narrative, it's all like, that's what's got the fans excited. And I think missing that, the NBA is kind of tone deaf on that. Like, they don't know, they haven't gotten the memo yet that we're in an era where that's what matters.
Yeah. If that was the NBA, then that probably would have been a game where AD and KD, it's like the Suns versus Lakers. AD and KD probably would have taken that game off. Yep. Like, it's meaningless. We're just going to rest up or do load management for the next one. Right? Yep.
Completely. Yeah. And we'd be unsure if they were even going to sign with the same teams again next year. So it's like, so I want to change to a separate topic here. Well, okay. I got 2 different topics and you tell me which one sounds more fun.
All right.
In what ways is the church, we can say specifically the Catholic Church or just all churches, also missing what's happening with this meaning crisis and missing the opportunity, even though people are starting to turn more towards religion, ways in which that's being missed. The other topic is you are literally a full-time creator. You derive your income from podcasting, courses, books, what people would call a creator. And yet you're basically off social media now. Like, how does that work? That's the other topic. Which one do you want to do?
Oh man. I don't know. Maybe let's talk about the church for a little bit. That feels more fun.
Let's do it. So I am not trying to set this up as like, I'm going to get TK to criticize the Catholic Church. I think he's a Catholic, because I think this applies largely across the board. But there seems to be this funny thing. And by the way, I always feel so comfortable saying things that are somewhat critical of the Catholic Church, because every time I'm around Catholics, there's no possible way to be more critical of Catholicism than Catholics are. So I feel very safe. So find someone.
That's true. I never heard. I've watched so many Protestant Catholic debates on the papacy, whatever. Read so many things by Protestants and their objections to the papacy, but I did not hear the best arguments against the papacy until I became Catholic. I'm hanging out with them.
No, that's why I'm always like, find someone who loves you as much as Catholics hate the Pope. You know. so you have this thing happening that we've talked about. And I remember I saw this, kind of in like the libertarian movement, which is not religious, at least not explicitly, where I started to see this window happening, this meaning crisis, people searching for it and gravitating to people like Jordan Peterson and all these libertarian organizations, instead of recognizing that and saying, hey, let's have Jordan Peterson come and talk. He's not directly libertarian, but he's talking about themes that are relevant to us, right? He's talking about tyranny and how do you avoid tyranny and chaos and all these things, spontaneous, or like there's some, instead of that, they were like, no, that's terrible. Let's like go the other direction and just do like more and more of the like standard, Skeptic magazine, Sam Harris, whatever. And because of that, they lost relevance and it basically fell apart. All these organizations and conferences that used to be really cool and popular.
Libertarian movement, you're saying?
Yeah, totally. Like you remember like Students for Liberty conferences and stuff. They were like huge. No one cared after they missed that. They didn't get that like what people are actually craving is a thing that we already know how to do and talk about. And they're like, instead of getting into like intellectual depth and like moral questions, which libertarianism has a rich history of addressing. Yeah. Instead of that, they're like, let's try to be cool and let's have like cool rock bands come to our events and like be like shallow and try to appeal to like the base level things, right? And I feel like the church has had a similar thing where it's like people are craving, frankly, all of the hardest parts about Christianity. Like, I want rigor. I want fasting, right? Like there's like a whole secular fasting movement. People that are like, I want to fast because it's good for my health or because of discipline or whatever. Like meditation, sitting and not doing anything and not talking for an hour at a time. Secular people are interested in this now. The church is like, we have thousands of years of this kind of hardcore stuff. And instead, so many churches, the Protestant mega churches are just like, we'll give you free coffee and everything will be easy. We promise you'll get rich, right? Catholic Church seems to be, at least on its leadership, similarly like, hey, let's get rid of the Latin mass. Nobody understands it. Let's be a little more relaxed. And it's like, no, what culture wants right now is exactly what you've had for thousands of years. And right at the moment they come seeking it, you're like, oh, instead, let's make like toys that look like anime characters and call them like Catholic icons, or you know what I mean? I need your take on that.
Yeah. So first, let me add something to the framing of it. It's similar to what you experience with the disciplining your kids. At one level, your kids just want you to give them easy. They don't want you to impose discipline and boundaries. They want you to just let them do whatever they want and give them what they want. But at another level, even beyond their conscious knowing, they want you to provide discipline. They want you to be an enforcer. And there's something about you that they will resent and they won't respect you if you try too hard to be their friend. And it's like the best way to be friends to your kids is to genuinely love them without needing to be their friend. If you need to be their friend too bad and you need to be liked by them too bad, yes, you will avoid the conflict of ticking them off and annoying them, but they won't respect you and they'll resent you. And so you have to have both, right? There's a sense in which I'm genuinely interested in connecting with you and being right there with you and being a family with you. And there's also this sense in which it is completely unimportant to me that you think what I'm doing is cool or that you feel amazing about this. I'm going to stick to my guns on what I know to be right from the vantage point of being a leader. And I think right now, the world in many ways resents a lot of the so-called restrictions and restraints of traditions, and they constantly shit test it, right? They constantly push back. Well, why don't you do this? Why don't you change that? Why do the priests have to be guys? Well, why do you have to have confession? Why can't we do confessions with deacons? Or why do we have to have the liturgy be this way? Why can't we change it this way? And at the same time, if you just bend to it and you just give them everything they want, they'll be like, oh, I'm bored. I heard one guy put it this way. He says, I actually was part of a rock band. And so I know what good rock music sounds like. And so when I go to church that's trying to do that, I'm immediately bored because there is no church that can do it better than the real thing. And so whenever the church tries to compete with the world at being cool, relevant, and entertaining, you lose because the God of this world is going to beat you at that every time. But it's when the church says we're going to do what we do best, holiness, forgiveness, redemption. We're going to do the things that the God of this world can't emulate. The God of this world can do bells and whistles. The God of this world can do smoke and mirrors. The God of this world can do theater and music and all of that. And so he wants that competition. Throw that snake on the ground, throw that staff on the ground, and he'll throw his staff on the ground. And we got snake versus snake, you know, he wants that. But what is it that you can do that can totally devour what he does? I once heard, I forgot who the saint was, who said that, the one thing that the enemy cannot do is humility. And it's when he fears you the most and when he is most confused, because it's something that he just can't understand. But he can understand pride. He can understand competitiveness. He can understand skill and talent. So anyway, I do think there is something to be said about many churches, whether that be at a local level, regardless of denomination. There is kind of this divide in Christendom today where you have certain churches or church leaders who really, really want to connect, really, really want to be relevant. And they're running the risk of going too far and being resented by the world and losing the world's respect by failing to understand what really makes them valuable. And sometimes even when you win people over, you got to ask the question, well, what am I winning them over to? So we experienced this with Praxis when we would go to these conferences and we'd have a booth and there's nothing other than some information about the program and a sign-up sheet where you can get more information and a person who can answer your questions about it. And then right next to us, to our left and to our right, there's some nonprofit that nobody cares about, but they got Kit Kats and Skittles and bottles of Gatorade, and hundreds of students are going there. And in order to get the thing that they want, you got to, sign your little name on the email. And so those booths get a ton of people, they get a ton of signatures, and there is not a single student that knows what that organization is there for or even cares. They're going to ignore the email. They're just going to give you what you want because they're attracted to the Skittles. They're attracted to the bottles of Gatorade. We would only get 5 students that would come up to our table, and every single one of them would be really interested, and they respond to the emails and they become a customer, right? And so sometimes when you do things that compromise yourself to get the crowd, it's like, yeah, but what are you winning? You're getting attention, you're getting people to show up, but you're not getting people that are willing to die for anything substantial here,
If we were smarter, TK, what we should have done at those booths was, here's our sign-up list. If nothing else, and people are like, what's this? And we tell them. And then when they go to sign up, put their email down. We say, whoa, what do you think you're doing? You can't just put your email down there. What do you mean? You got to give me a couple Kit Kats and $5 before you put you got to pay me if you want to do that. Then we would have really filtered them out. We wouldn't even needed to do application interviews after that.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So as you were talking, it was really interesting because you used the analogy of children.
Yeah.
And it kind of made me realize, culturally, and you see a lot of studies and people talking about this, we're in a place where the culture by and large is kind of in a state of arrested development. People live at home with their parents longer than ever. They're waiting longer than ever to get married if they ever get married, and to have children if they ever have children, and to get out of debt, to be independent, to be self-sufficient, to live like what we would have said were adults. And so you have a culture, and by the way, divorce is so high. So most people have grown up without one parent or with less than 2 full-time parents. And so you have a culture of people who are kind of juvenile and missing and partially orphaned in a way, missing some of the parental, especially fatherly influence. What do they need? That's exactly what they need. And that's one of the few things the church can give them: a spiritual father, a sense of family and structure that comes with the things that are lacking. And instead, the church is like, not always, but often, hey, let's make it more childlike. Let's make it easier to digest. Let's not keep serving meat. Let's serve milk. And it's like, well, that's what they're already drowning in. But you have something that they can't get anywhere else. Other than your actual family, there's hardly anywhere else you can go in culture and get something approximating a father figure in a way that is healthy and not like messed up, right? And that's like part of the structure of the church is like you have a spiritual father, you have godparents, you have people that like you have this sort of structure that's what helps you grow up into an adult. And in a culture of children, what they're seeking are adult influences. And if the adults around them are trying to be children to cater to them, right? It's like you're missing the point.
Oh, dude, I got a great story about this. So, you know, in the church, we have a cycle of scripture readings for each mass. And this one Sunday, so the last Sunday of every month, we have a Sunday symposium, the Minimalists. And there's a Greenway Court Theater in LA. We do a live show. And so on that Sunday, I usually just find some church in LA that I go to, and it's not my usual parish. On this particular Sunday, one of the readings was about wives submit to your husbands, and husbands to love your wives, lay down your lives for your wives, you know, loving them as Christ loved the church. And you know, the priest reads the passage, and then when he comes out to give his homily, and this church is like, it's like predominantly Asian, and it's a pretty big church, right? I'm definitely like the only brother up in there. Not the only brother in Christ.
It's like a Jackie Chan movie in there.
Yeah, I'm like Chris Tucker. I'm like, man, what is going on up in this church? What are you talking about, man? So the priest, he comes out to start his homily, and he goes, ladies, how many of you believe that the husband is the head of the wife? And all the women's hands went up, and they were like, yes. It's like, oh, okay, right, all right. And then the priest says, how many of you believe that wives need to submit to their husbands? And all the women in that place were like, yeah. I was like, man, like Asia's about to take over, bro. Like they on another level, man. They on another level of family. All these women were like, he's asking all these questions like about men leading and how many of these women here want men to lead. I'm like, wow, he's doing like a whole survey, like asking the women in church. Like they were like yelling, like, yeah, they want men to lead. They believe in this, right?
See, now if you were in like a typical suburban, like mostly white Protestant church, and a dude was like, how many of you think that the husband is the head of the household? Probably the women would cheer and say, yeah, but there'd be a little bit of laughter. And then when he said, how many of you think you should submit to your husband? They would all assume that this was naturally a joke. And then they'd all start laughing because it'd be like, well, of course, none of us want to submit, right? It would all just be like, no one would think it was a serious question.
Oh, it gets better because this dude asked that and they're like, yeah, right? And I'm like, okay, this the most base thing I have seen. I don't know where I'm at today, but this is the most base thing I've seen. And then the priest says, well, he goes, the important thing to remember, I maybe he had his homily already prepared. I don't know. And he wasn't expecting this. You know how that is. Sometimes you have a story that you like or a question that you like.
You're expecting the audience to think one thing, and you know it will work well as long as that assumption holds true.
Right. Or sometimes you're hoping that nobody knows the answer so you can give it to them. And then there's some kid who's like, it's this. So you're like, okay, thanks for ruining my teacher moment, kid. So I think that must have happened here because the priest goes, well, the important thing to remember is this was written a long time ago. He says, this was written a long time ago. The world was very, very different. And he goes, that was another place and another time. The point is, we all have to submit to each other. As brothers, we submit to each other. As sisters, we submit to each other. Like, how many of our brothers and sisters here? Sisters, submit to your brother. Brothers, submit to your sister. Because we all have something to give, and we all submit to one another. And I'm just like, oh, like from a casual observation as a visitor here, I don't know if that's what your people wanted. I think it looks to me like your people wanted the way Paul was putting it down.
They're literally like begging for that to be true. And he's like, don't worry. That doesn't have to be true. And they're all like, oh, well, we really wanted that.
Hey, man, I don't know about any other local parishes out there, but it seemed to me like the wives at this church was all about wanting their man to lead and eager to submit to them, while their man felt the pressure of loving them like Christ loved the church. They seemed to, whatever was going on with these ladies, they seemed to be really down with the way Paul was putting it down. And his priest was like, look, and so this will be an example of what you call the tone deaf thing, where sometimes the world couldn't be asking any clearer.
Right.
They're like, man, I'm so exhausted by like things that weren't even a thing until 10 years after I was born.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's older than me?
Yep.
You know, is there anything that gives me some stability?
And it's so moving when someone comes with that heart, because we assume, if we're already a Christian, we assume that non-Christians are like, I want it to be easy. I want you to settle all my objections. I want you to, and when they really come, it's like, let me take the scraps from the table, Lord. Even a dog gets the scraps from the table. Just let me be like a dog and get the scraps, right? Like the woman in the Bible. And actually just watched the movie version of The Best Christmas Pageant Ever, which my mom used to read to us at Christmas time, which is amazing. But it's such a great picture of that, right? All the church people, it's like, they're totally taken aback that the wild, savage, unchurched kids are just like, give me that. I want that. I want that. What are the beauty in that story? Like, yes, yeah, cool. Let's go. I think just being ready for that. So I got to tell a story, because you told one about a Catholic service where the homily totally like robbed the joy of the room and missed the mark. So I got to throw some, Protestant story in there. So we go to a Christmas Eve service at a big church here in town, and it was a very beautiful service. It was very moving, pretty music, and just sort of reading scripture. It was very simple. But there was one little part where they're like, okay, the kids pastor is going to get up and do like a little thing for the kids. And I think it was like while they were handing out candles for a candlelight song or something. And it was like Christmas trivia. And this was like sola scriptura gone bad. It was like so everyone's like very emotional, because we've just had a lot of beautiful songs together and old hymns about Christmas. And, some people are crying and stuff. It's very moving. It's a very beautiful, Christmas service, the way very respectful and holy. And then they're doing this little Christmas trivia thing. And it's literally like, let me ruin Christmas for you using the Bible and only the Bible. Because it's like, okay, kids, you answer, and if you get it right, we'll like give you a candy cane or something. So they're like, okay, did the angels, according to the Bible, sing when they announced to the shepherds? And little Timmy raises his hand, and he's like, and it's like they're all true or false. He's like, twoo. And they're like, I'm sorry, Timmy, it is false. It does not say that anywhere in the Bible. I'm not kidding. This went on for like 15 questions. They're like, did we're like
it's like a James White Christmas.
I'm trying to think of a couple of the other ones. Like all things that we all know. Oh, were there animals present in the manger at the birth of Jesus? False. I'm sorry, little Sarah. It doesn't say that in the Bible specifically. And you're like, this is forget all the others. This is the greatest argument against sola scriptura I've ever heard. We all know that angels were singing glory to God in the highest. We all know that there were animals in that manger. We know it in our soul. Every depiction, every icon, every story that's ever been told about this thing includes these elements because they were there. No, Luke didn't specifically say that word, but he didn't exclude it either. Like, this is part of the tradition of the church. This is in there. But it was like, it was hilarious. The pastors were like, even I didn't realize this one. But no, it turns out a lot of our ideas about Christmas just aren't in the Bible. Sorry. It was like crushing all these kids' Christmas dreams. It was the worst, I swear. It was I was sitting there and looking at my wife and just like, it's like, what are they doing?
I feel like now I want to I want a movie called A James White Christmas, where James White is asking these kind of questions, and Timmy's like, "Yes, the angels were singing," and James White goes, "Sorry, Timmy, not as defined by Vatican I."
I literally walked away being like, wow, Christmas is a lot less holy according to the Bible, I guess. You know, like it's not like, you know, is Santa Claus, is the Grinch a part of Christmas? No, that's not, you know, it's all about baby Jesus. It was literally like, no, the baby Jesus story is just less like magical than you thought it was. Oh man, it was rough.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Well,
So
is a thought. Well,
go ahead. Go ahead. No, you're good.
I do want to say a couple of thoughts about like the church and how the church responds, and because there are some things that have changed about how I see and define the church, and also what I think is the best way to reach the lost, whether people seem to be hungry or not. The first thing I say, and I think of this in Catholic terms, but it's not limited to that. You know, sometimes you'll hear Catholics and non-Catholics be like, "Oh man, the church is co-opted, the church is infiltrated, the church is losing its way." And I think that's a dangerous way to think, not because of any apologetic interest, but rather because of it evinces a failure of the imagination. So many times when we say church, what we mean is that subset of the hierarchy that is involved in sin or scandal. And so we mean there's the Pope, there's a few celebrity bishops, some celebrity pastors, some popular influencers, and they seem to be missing the mark. But when people say the church is losing its way, they're not talking about like the boring priests who live in Iowa and Milwaukee that no one knows about because they're just showing up for their parishioners and living boring holy lives serving people. Nobody talks about the 5 people that show up to the rosary group every day 30 minutes before mass. You know, nobody's thinking specifically about the sacraments or the saints and all of these types of things. And it's like there are so many people who are the church, who are putting their lives on the line in prayer, in spiritual discipline, and also in just quiet labor, serving other people, working with the sick, being there for people. And I think the church has always been and always will be alive and well, but that's not necessarily reflected in the hierarchy or in that subset of the hierarchy that has some sort of celebrity status, right? And so I think it's so good for our faith to make sure that we're always connected to that aspect of the church, you know, because whatever criticisms people might make of the Pope or whatever, you know, like there was the I think this might have been several months ago. There was like the video of Pope Francis sitting at what looked like a circus event, and it was, man, I must have had about like 5
My favorite game, by the way, is find the latest video on Twitter of Pope Francis and then call TK and be like, explain this one.
Dude, I get so many of those where it's basically, is this your king? Right? Videos of Pope Francis. Is this your king?
See, this is what Christ said, pick up your cross and follow me. The Pope is your cross to bear. He's doing you a service by making you surrender your reputation and be like, yep, that's my Pope.
So there's this video of him just at a circus, right? And I mean, if you haven't seen a Pope Francis video by now, it's like he's usually not sitting there looking like smiling or very expressive, right? So he's there looking either however you want to call it, grumpy or plain face or just whatever. And you've got people like dressed in circus, and circuses are already just like kind of weird. It's like, so people doing these circus dances, and the Pope is just sitting there.
Oh man, this is rough. I have no idea what it's going to be like on the recording. but TK just completely froze. We'll see if we can get him back here. And I have no editing skills nor the time to do it. So let me just see if I can get him. Okay. I'm literally calling TK right now.
Just about the box your cord was only partially plugged.
That's the devil. All right. Peace. So let me give everyone here an update since I'm not going to edit this. Sorry, too lazy. TK's cord was only partially plugged in and it came unplugged. So he is dialing back in shortly to finish his story about the Pope and the circus. And then I think we'll probably bring the conversation home with I want to ask the question to TK, when it feels like the church is losing, how would we know? What would it actually look like if the church was winning? I think that's a much harder question to answer than maybe it first seems. So I think we can get into some interesting territory there. So let's see if we can get TK back on this call in the next few minutes. Otherwise, I'll just have to monologue endlessly. Nobody wants that. You can just fast forward until you start hearing TK's voice. But let's go Detroit Lions. I don't know when you're going to be listening to this, but for me, this is 2 days before final game of the season against the Minnesota Vikings. Very, very, very nerve-wracking. If the Lions were healthy, or even just as healthy as the average NFL team with like 6 or 7 guys out, I would have no worries at all. In fact, I've never seen a better team except for the 2007 Patriots, and I would be so confident we're going to steamroll our way to the Super Bowl. We have like 22 guys out with injury, probably 5 or 6 of which are Pro Bowlers, mostly on our defense, which is just terrifying. I just think it's too much to overcome. So that's my Lions take. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope they find a way to overcome it, which would be, to my mind, the single greatest accomplishment I've ever seen in sports. We'll see. All right, let's see if we can get TK back in here in the next few minutes. Hey, guess who's back?
La 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 la.
Dude, you just
Can you see me?
had to pull a Dr. Dre and be like, I'm going to just disappear from the game for a while. Right when I'm in my epic run, maybe it was a Lauryn Hill. I don't know, make everybody, Okay, so I just kept it recording because I'm too lazy to do any editing. And then I just like chatted for a few minutes and then did nothing. So you got cut off when you were saying Grumpy Pope is watching a weird circus act. That was where it got cut off.
Yeah. And just a quick little point of divergence here. I truly believe that if the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter were around today, we'd have a much harder time believing what they say, because you would have to look at them and see them. And they would have so many opportunities to offend us and make us doubt them and make us less inclined to take what they say seriously. Can you imagine the Apostle Paul walking down the street, somebody's got a cell phone on him, and they ask him, what does he think about Trump? Or they make a joke, and maybe he doesn't laugh at the joke. And some people feel like, why does he got to be so serious all the time? Like, why does he got to be so tone deaf? You know what I mean?
I mean, according to tradition, he was kind of a George Costanza looking guy, like kind of short, bald, not very attractive. That's the, that's the tradition anyway. So you just add that to our current cultural moment.
But okay, so anyway, back to Pope Francis, but because this is something that I don't just get texts from Catholic friends being like, is this your king? There are conversations that happen within the Catholic Church about this kind of stuff. And you've got some people who they will say, look, you guys are overreacting. There is nothing wrong with this. The Vatican has done this as a tradition for several years. They have a circus performance. It's innocent. Like, technically, there is no argument you can make that like a circus is inherently sinful and like it's anti-apostolic to do that, right? and all
you gotta do is just show me a picture of a clown, and it's like game, set, match.
And that always feels like one of those things where it's like, it's kind of like defending Scottie Pippen. It's like, okay, I can do that. I can go with you, but I can only do that 20 more times. Because there's gonna come a point where I just can't defend it anymore. It's like, or I'm gonna defend John Morant again. Okay. But
so, go ahead.
Okay, so anyway, and so you have these debates, and there are people like, well, I don't care if it's technically permissible, and if it's not technically contradictory, it's like it's a bad look. And it can be so easy and understandable to want a pope who wouldn't allow himself to be seen at a circus. It can be so easy to want a pope who is maybe a little more based, or to want a pope who can see the culture and say, hey guys, I can see that you feel like you're being bullied. I can see that you feel like you're being attacked, and I want to let the world know these my people over here. Leave them alone. It'd be, like, or you want a pope who says, hey, look, the Latin Mass is an ancient and beautiful tradition. I want to make that as accessible as possible for the people who want it. I want to, uphold those ancient traditions, right? And Pope Francis does a lot of things and says a lot of things that people can look at and say, man, I just wish I had a more based pope. And I think what's so important to remember at the individual level is that holiness is the greatest apologetic. And it's easy to get caught in discussions about what the church at a hierarchical level is missing out on, that you forget that you going to one mass has a greater impact on the world than Pope Francis going to 1,000 circuses, right? You going to Eucharistic adoration once a week is going to have more of an impact on the conversion of souls than any creepy, weird looking mascot doll that some members of the hierarchy thought was going to be cool for 2025 to represent missions work. And it's for me, it's not even a matter of being like, don't ever defend the Pope or defend the Pope. It's a matter of just remembering that, like, man, when it comes to me and what I can control and what I can do, am I showing up for prayer? Am I showing up for fasting? Am I showing up and doing the work of the liturgy? Am I doing the work of being holy in my own life? Because the church is always bigger than the people up top that are having debates about canon law, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and if Christianity teaches and demonstrates anything, it's usually the thing that you most need to do is the thing that you least want to do, right? It's like it's fun and easy to debate about this or that, right? When the man came to Jesus and said, I'm keeping all of the law, what else do I need to do to be saved? He didn't say, okay, you need to decide whether you believe the Pharisees or the Sadducees about the resurrection of the dead. I want you to figure out which argument's correct, right? He was like, you don't need to think about anybody else, any other person's interpretation of give everything you can to the poor. Because he knew that was the thing that guy was holding on to the tightest.
Hey, by the way, I got a question for you about that passage. Because Jesus answers the question that the guy asked and leaves it at that. And according to the guy, he's already doing that. Okay. Jesus didn't give him any more to do until the guy says, I'm already doing that. And I've been doing that since my youth. Like, I'm curious. I know it's speculation. But I'm curious, what do you think? How do you think that conversation unfolds? If when Jesus tells him what to do, he says, thank you, Lord. I will strive my best to do that.
I mean, honestly, I think he walks away and he joins the church and he's fine. Like, I do. Because I could be wrong on this. I have not read hundreds and thousands of years of church fathers talking about this passage ever. But my take on that is very much the guy wasn't actually seeking just what he first asked. What do I do to be saved? Because the answer was too easy. He was seeking, how do I flex my righteousness? What's the next level? Okay, like I'm doing this. It's the next thing. I keep all the law. Like I keep all of it. I'm doing all of it. Hardly anybody did that then, right? Especially if you were not a priest or whatever. Like I'm keeping all of it. What else? There's got to be more, right? Like I want to be that hardcore next level guy. And Jesus is like, oh, really? Okay. So literally sell everything. Like that's it. That's the next level, and he kind of called his bluff a little bit. Like that's kind of how I take it anyway. And I think that's a great point. It's like, don't go seeking like spiritual one-upsmanship, right? Like do what your duty is. And if you go start asking, how do I be even holier? Right? You probably don't want to know the answer. You know what I mean? You better mean it. So we've been talking about, I think it's a great topic to kind of bring us home. We've kind of both been talking, at least I have, I won't put this on you, and kind of insinuating in some ways that the church is losing, or is losing an opportunity, or is missing a mark. We've been talking about the ways that like the church, very broadly speaking, I don't want to debate whether Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, like what counts as the church, but just Christian churches in general, missing this opportunity in many ways, what people are looking for, blah, blah, blah. But I've really been having this question over and over again lately in my mind for, I don't know, the last 6 months or so. And it keeps bugging me. And the question is, what would it look like if the church was winning? Like, what does it mean? Is the church winning or losing? And what would it look like? How would I know if it was winning? And I think our kind of like fleshly fantasies, it's easy to be like, well, if the church was winning, you wouldn't have commercials on TV with scantily clad women, and we imagine this really nice Christianized society, and this politician would win, and this policy wouldn't be passed, and this would be illegal, and this, people they all have their own fantasy about what that would mean, people who are Christians. But when you look at the history of the church, which is in the Old Testament, the history of the nation of Israel, that was the original church, and then after Christ, it is the Christian church and Christ himself. Every time that they're winning, it looks like they're losing, right? Like, what is the greatest victory? Mm-hmm. It's the cross, which looks from an external perspective like the greatest loss. I mean, even the birth of Christ, when he came into the world and incarnate, God incarnated as man to save humanity, this should be the greatest victory. From a worldly perspective, a baby is born in some poor place to some poor family. And what does Herod immediately do? Murders all of the Jewish babies. How can that look like winning? The Messiah comes and the first thing that happens is all the Jewish babies get murdered. That's like as much of a losing moment as you can have. And yet it was the moment that was the most victorious in terms of what it meant for God's plan. So like, the martyrs, they're being killed. The disciples are being killed and martyred. That was the moment that the church was actually winning, right? Like under persecution. And so winning in the church usually looks like losing in the world. So when I think about that and I internalize it, I'm like, what would it mean? Like maybe the church is winning now, maybe they're not. I don't know. Are they persecuted enough? Maybe they look like too good right now. Maybe if the church needs to look like it's utterly defeated, and that's probably the moment where in the spiritual realm it's winning the most. I don't know how to square those things, because you'll also have people talk about the golden era, Constantine or whatever, like Rome itself, which is what the Apostle Paul was trying to do, convert the emperor. Like literally, like I want to get in front of the emperor so I can convert him to Christianity. And that eventually happened a couple hundred years after Paul's death, but like literally the very government that was killing all the Christians became Christian. Did that represent, like, is that the vision of victory for the church, where the entire world is government on down is all Christian? Or was that like the moment when they were the most spiritually vulnerable? And because what do you see after that? Just constant conflict and war and violence and schism, and every pope excommunicating every other pope, and Antioch and Rome and Alexandria fight. I don't know. Like, I don't know. It's a really hard question for me to answer. So I want to pose it to you. Let's just say America in present day. What would it look like for the church to be winning today in America?
So I'm going to use an example you gave me one time. What does it look like to do business? Well, a whole lot of different ways, not just one. But what does it mean to be successful at business or to do business? Well, you got at least one customer, and you have a service or product, and they're paying you for it, period. If you're not doing that, I don't care what it looks like, it's not business. You're playing games. You might have a business card, you may have filed the LLC paperwork, you may have a meeting every Monday, you may wear a suit, but you're just doing something else. It's not business. You can lack all of those things, but if you have that, it's business. So that's what it means to do business, point blank, period. Very simple. But what does that
This is like a Lil Wayne moment. Like, I said that?
Hey, but that can look a lot of different ways, right? It can look like one person being a solopreneur. It can look like a whole big empire, right? It can look like a franchise. It can look like a startup. It can look a lot of different ways, all of which are legitimate. Now, we'll give an example from football. What does it look like to win a football game? I mean, so many different looks, right? It can look like a scrappy game where the score is 3-0. It can look like a game that's got overtime. It can look like a game that's happening in the snow, a game that's happening on a sunny day. It can look like a game that's a blowout. But what does it mean to win a football game? That when the time on the clock runs out, one team has more points than the other team. It's a very simple definition for what it means to win. What it looks like for that to happen, a whole lot of different ways, right? And I think whether it's with business, football, Christianity, anything else, when we define winning in terms of what it looks like, we create this problem where we can mistake ourselves for winning just because we've achieved these really glamorous victories in the outer realm of appearances. Yeah, we got that person in office, we're winning. Or yeah, we've made it so that those enemies of Christianity have been silenced. And by the way, cultural wins are a real thing. And sometimes cultural victories can be aligned with victory for the church, and sometimes it can be misaligned. But I think what it means for the church to win comes down to three things, and they're all kind of variations of the same. Number one, souls are converted. Number two, believers are sanctified. And number three, God is glorified, right? Non-believers are converted. Believers are sanctified. God is glorified.
I'm so glad that Rome didn't take that rhyming black preacher out of you.
Oh, man. I come home to Rome, but the Pentecostal ain't gone.
So good.
I'm Roman Pentecostal, man.
Okay, repeat that again. Say those three things.
Non-believers are converted. believers are sanctified, and God is glorified. Right now, let's look at two different looks for that. So during the time of Jesus, where he's building his church and he's working with his disciples, the church is winning. I mean, we literally have the most important thing happening right in real time. Jesus dies on the cross and he secures victory over death. The church is winning. And what does that look like? It looks like during Jesus's entire lifetime, and even going through the resurrection and the transfiguration, that the political powers that be in the place where Christians were are against him, and they're resisting him, and they want to kill his followers. And the apostles, who are clearly winning, they get martyred, all except for John, right? And so you could try to turn that into a formula and say, okay, so we knew that the church was winning at that time. So the way it should look is we're getting killed for our faith.
If leaders are dying, the church is flying.
Yeah, that's how we know we're winning, right? But then it's like, in the midst of all that, as believers are still getting martyred, there's this really powerful guy who has a conversion, and he says, hey, I'm one of them now. We got to stop all of that. No killing them. And not only that, because he is identifying as one of them and he's a person with status, all of a sudden it becomes socially valuable to be seen as one of these Christians, even if you don't really take their faith seriously. Now, was that a reward for the martyrdom? Was it punishment from God? I mean, Christianity is winning, and this guy emerges in a context where the church is winning and dying.
And then a whole new, is interesting. As you're talking, I'm sort of thinking of it in terms of if I'm going to be like a screw tape letters approach, and think of it from the perspective of the diabolical. A previous surface area of attack is now gone. I can no longer use the let's murder the Christians to snuff them out and scare them away from the gospel.
Yeah.
So now, but I have a new surface area. Let's turn Christianity into something really fluffy and shallow and political. And now you got some guy who wants the favor of the emperor and says, all right, fine, I'll convert to Christianity if you give me and my tribe a whole bunch of lands that we get to rule. And you start to have fake Christians left and right? It's a new surface area for the enemy. And the fact that those problems exist doesn't necessarily answer the question of whether or not the church is winning.
Right, because what you could say is like, well, see, and this is where, and a lot of people tell the story in this way. They say, now, once that happens, everybody gets rich and comfortable, and the church has been dying ever since because everybody was comfortable. But what we actually see in this context is the birth of monasticism and the power of monastic spirituality, because there are Christians who say, look, Jesus made it pretty clear. Martyrdom is the only way to heaven. Some form of martyrdom, right? Self-mortification. We've got to take up our cross. Since we are no longer being given the gift of martyrdom from God through persecution, we now must voluntarily engage in ascetic discipline so that we can die to ourselves, because we got to die to ourselves in order to get to heaven. And so people begin to dedicate themselves to a life of self-mortification and ascetic discipline, precisely as a way to counteract just the force of just like unprecedented amount of comfort, and recognizing the dangers of that comfort. And so as these outer cultural victories are happening, cathedrals are being built, Christian art is flourishing, monastic spirituality is really developing. And so in every generation, there are victories that the church is claiming through the power of the Holy Spirit. And there is ground that the enemy is trying to take. And God allows, for various reasons in his providence, for certain cultural victories to happen, for certain cultural battles to be lost. God allows certain leaders to emerge who are not kind towards our faith, and certain leaders to emerge who support our faith. And it's not clear at all that these leaders are a reward or punishment for our faithfulness. Because again, at a time when the church was thriving, at times when the church was thriving, you've had both kind of leaders emerge. You know, like certainly Herod wasn't punishment for Jesus not sticking to his mission enough.
So you just made me realize maybe I need to actually repent for even asking the question. Because asking, what does it look like if the church is winning? Is the church winning right now? Like, what's the score? It kind of reminds me of, remember in the Old Testament, I don't even remember which king, like, I want to do a census. And God was like, no, don't do a census, right? A census is basically, I want to know how powerful I am as a king. Okay, God, you've blessed me. How much have you blessed me? Let me tally it up. Let me just see how I compare to the other nations, right? And God was like, no, that's wrong, right? I don't remember who it was. Forgive me. I'm too far removed from my heavy duty Bible study days where I could cite this stuff top of my head. But essentially the walk away was like, the concept of a census is like, that for this particular king, at least, was a sin, was a vice, was a way of, let's just see how much power I have. Let's see how good I am, right? And it's like, you don't need to know. Remember Isaiah and him being like, oh, there's nobody. It's only me. And God was like, you have no idea. There's a remnant. There's thousands.
Yeah.
You'll never get to know who they are or how many they are. Tough. Yeah. But they're there. And you're supposed to be obedient and preach for them, whether or not you ever meet them. And I love that. It's the same concept of be kind to everybody. You never know when you're entertaining angels. And I'm not going to tell you, sorry, is this guy an angel? Do I have to be nice to him? Be nice to all of them. I'm not going to tell you, right? Like that concept.
But by the way, Isaac, sometimes, and I know you're not doing this, but sometimes even when we get caught up with like, man, is the church winning? It speaks to that tribal need we have to make sure we're part of a winning team. Everybody wants to be part of a winning group. One of the reasons why the Pope is such a thorn in the side for many Catholics is because we have to deal with our Protestant family members and friends being like, ha, 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 is this your man? And it feels embarrassing. And like, even if we don't care, it's like, darn it, right? I just want to be a part of something that everybody sees as based. And I think the real question here is, what is God up to in the world? You know, how is the Holy Spirit moving? And how can I be a part of that? You know, you look at in the Catholic Church, if you go to places in Europe, man, you've got all these old, beautiful cathedrals that are like the white sepulchres of which Christ spoke, which is like they're empty. Nobody's going there.
No, they're museums. They're like cultural oddities. They're not seen as living.
But then you go to Africa, by the way,
yeah,
and the Catholic faith is flourishing and they don't have all these cathedrals. And it's like all of these young African people are becoming priests and they're like the lifeblood of the church right now. So it's like, where is God moving? Where is the Holy Spirit moving?
You know, you said, I'm not accusing you of this, of Isaac, of wanting to be a part of the winning team, which is true. I am not guilty of that. But I actually am very much guilty. I have to struggle all the time of the opposite. I'm always like, because I have like a rebel outsider sort of thing. I want to be a part of the losing team. I'm like an underdog guy. And I'm really uncomfortable if the church starts winning and it's cool to be a Christian and it's culturally ascendant. That's actually much more uncomfortable for me, which is the genesis of this question. Like people feel like Christianity is on a comeback, it's winning. And that gets me really uncomfortable because I'm like, oh, that's probably a bad thing. Right. And that assumption that, oh, it's probably a bad thing to win. Like that's kind of a problem too, right? I remember when I was around 16, about 17, I was dating this girl and I was all in love with her. We broke up and I was like, you know what? Forget it. I don't want girls anymore. I don't want anything. I want to just go. I'd been on some mission trips. I just want to go and be a missionary. I want to go to the most dangerous places possible. And I want to die for my faith. Like I'm ready. I'm ready to go to heaven. I don't, of course, when you're that age and you break up with a girl, you think like there's nothing else to live for. So why not? Let's go, And I really felt strongly, I want to go on the mission field. I want to go to the most dangerous places. And if I die for my faith, that'd be amazing. Let's go.
Yeah.
And I think for me, what appears and seemed like, oh, that's the most courageous thing. That's the hardest thing. That was actually like an easier thing. I have no idea if I was actually in that situation, if it would feel easy or not. But like in my imagination, what that represented, me going to dangerous countries and preaching the gospel, that was easier than what ended up happening. I met another girl. I got married. started having kids, and my version of picking up my cross, it would have been way easier for me to go and be an unmarried man traveling around the world in dangerous places and maybe dying young for some crazy adventurous version of Christianity.
Yeah.
The cross I had to bear was that I don't get to do that. It's George Bailey and It's a Wonderful Life. It's like, sorry, the good that you can do is here in Bedford Falls. You don't get to go out and do all that other stuff. And there's a kind of death in that. And what does Christ say? I'll never forget, TK. You told me the story. I don't remember the name of the saint. There's a story of a saint who is like, denounce Christ or else you'll burn at the stake. Like stomp on the icon of Christ. And she hears the Holy Spirit say to her, stomp on the icon. And I could be getting it wrong, but what I took away from this was like next level. Like, okay, I refuse to denounce Christ and I get burned at the stake. That's horrible. I can't even imagine. Horrible. But like, there's a certain romanticism around it where you can see being like, yeah, let's go. I mean, I'm that kind of guy. I'm like underdog down. I'm a Lions fan, for goodness sake. I'm going to go down with the ship. Yeah, you're going to have to kill me,
Yeah.
But saying, oh, no. Sacrifice that reputation. Oh, let everyone believe you're a bandwagon fan. Jump off the Lions bandwagon when they're bad and don't suffer the martyrdom. And then everyone will accuse you. That would be a much worse cross for me personally to bear. And sometimes your cross looks like that. Sometimes it looks like that. And like I think that's what's so hard about it. Is like, what does it look like for the church to be winning? You probably shouldn't even ask that question. What does it look like for you as a Christian to be living righteous? Probably whatever the thing is that you really want, it's not that. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting.
You're really, really holy, then maybe your wants are aligned. And sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
I'm not throwing that out there and saying like, it's always about being miserable, but like, what is that really hard to, what does it mean to pick up your cross? Because the cross is more than just physical death. It's scorn and shame and everybody saying, you're a fraud. Oh, you betrayed me. I thought you were the Messiah, but you betrayed me, right? Like it's all of those things. What does that mean? To be willing to give up your reputation in this day and age? That's probably the hardest thing for anybody to give up. And what does that look like?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, with respect to, it's probably something you don't like. You and I have had a lot of conversations about ideas like John Piper's Christian hedonism, the notion of Erwin Raphael McManus talks about this. The more you are entrusted to God, the more you can trust your passions. And there's always that dilemma, right, in the faith of like, how do I know if my passions are right? Because the heart is wicked and deceitful above all things, right? Yeah. But yet he promised to give me a new heart. And I think one of the concepts in Catholic theology is the notion of disordered appetites. And one of the consequences of sin is that it disorders our appetites such that we take greater pleasure in worldliness and we find the things of the spirit to be boring and more uncomfortable, not because they are intrinsically that, but because we have been disordered. And through this process of sanctification, we are learning to enjoy the richness and of true beauty. And so holiness is an acquired taste that is developed over time through submission to God. And so the way that God calls us to live is uncomfortable and it is painful. And there are many aspects of it that are unlikable, but as we become more fit for heaven, to use the kind of C.S. Lewis's idea of like becoming more fit for heaven, we find, oh, this is the real pleasure. This is the real good thing. Another thing too is, I said earlier that, the church is winning when souls are converted, believers are sanctified, and God is glorified. The tricky part of that is that's only a good definition of winning, but it's not a good definition of what winning looks like because you don't have the luxury of being able to see those things, so it may be the case that every day when you get on your knees and you pray for the salvation of your family and your friends and so on, you don't see anything. And it may be the case that after you die, there's going to be some missionary that just gets tons of results that people are going to celebrate. And that might be the result of your prayers. that did not seem to go rewarded at all during your lifetime, right? Or you being sanctified. To people that may know you, they may be like, this dude seems the same to me. His personality's the same. He doesn't look like a holy man to me, but you may know for yourself. Father Gregory Pine says that holiness is a secret between you and God, right? And there are some things that no one's ever going to know about the way in which God is purifying you, but you know it and you can feel it. But you don't really get to see that in others. You only get to know that about yourself. And so it's kind of like the age-old question of like, why aren't miracles happening today? And I think part of the response to that is, why do you think you would be aware of them?
Yeah,
if they were happening? And because all the miracles in the scripture, the majority of people were completely unaware of them. And when many of them heard about it, they did not believe. You know?
So I got to bring this home. My wife is texting me. I got to go pick up pizza for the girls' sleepover.
Yeah.
I'll bring it home with this though, because you really, man, I have been meditating on this for days now since I read it. So our good friend, both of our friends, Derek McGill, has been telling me for years I need to read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And I've wanted to read it for forever. But it's one of those books that's so big where you're like, I got a bunch of short books I'll get through first, and then I'll get to it. And I've been putting it off, so I'm finally reading it. And it is so profound. It's a heavy, ponderous, very, very deep book. But there's this line, I'm like halfway through it, where this priest, so this monk, he says, basically, like, once you take it upon yourself that, and you believe that you are responsible for everything wrong in the world, you are responsible for all of the sins in the world, all the shortcomings in the world. Like, that's when you're in the right spot. And that sounds crazy at first. He said, he's talking about some guy who's like got that mindset. And he said he would ask forgiveness from the birds. And you're like, what does that mean? And what he's saying is that, because at first that sounds like almost glorifying sin too much. Like every time you make a little mistake, you're causing all this untold horror in the world. And it's actually the opposite, right? Because Lewis has this concept of evil doesn't have a existence in and of itself. It doesn't have any substance. It's just the perversion of good. And so what he's really talking about is the power of goodness. Lewis also has this thing where he's like, if you people talk about one small sin, that one drink you shouldn't have had can be the slippery slope that leads you to alcoholism and terrible things. But how much more so goodness has all the substance? Sin is just a perversion of goodness. How much more powerful is goodness? That one small good act you do is that stepping stone to how many greater things. Yeah. And that's what this concept from this character in the book, who's like, apologize to the birds for your lack of holiness. For if you were only a little bit nobler, they would be happier by your side. And what else would the world be? Like, if you were a little bit holier, do you know how much better the entire world would be? If you were truly holy, none of the problems in the world would exist. So like, take it on yourself when you see the church is messed up, politics is messed up. What can I do in my own life to just be a little more righteous, a little holier? And like, you may never see the fruit of that, but understanding that's the way that it actually works. That's the way the world actually gets transformed, by just choosing to be obedient and do what's right no matter what. And like, every time you do that by just a little bit, the ripple effect is this like amazing compounding thing. That just stuck with me. So like, I've been really pondering that since I read it. But I think it goes very well into what you're saying, that like, don't assume you would know what it looked like. But if you say, what do I have? What can I control? I can be obedient. I can do what I'm supposed to. If I'm Isaiah and I don't think anyone's listening, I can keep preaching because there's a remnant that I don't know about. If I'm called to do something, do it. You don't know the impact that can have. And like, that's how you bring about the victory of the church.
Yeah. That's how you become a saint. That's
it, man. That's it. Hey, we started with what's wrong with the NBA. We ended with what's right with the church. I don't know. Somehow there's a connection here. We'll let people make it for themselves. We'll let you figure that out on your own time.
Hey, man, tell the family I said what's up, man. Tell the girls enjoy pizza night, man. I haven't seen them in so long. Tell everybody I said what's up.
We'll make it happen. And we're going to try to do these like once a month. So we look forward to getting some more topics down. Peace,
All
man.
right, man. Much love.